Hey guys, I'm your host Tara A. Devlin, and welcome to this week's episode of Kowabana, true Japanese scary stories from around the internet. Today is a very special day, because Volume 3 of Toshiden is finally on sale. Kept you waiting, huh? I've been hard at work on this one, researching and collecting a bunch of brand new urban legends. Some you probably heard of, and others you no doubt haven't. And, to go with it, the Toshiden podcast will also return for Season 3, starting next week. So don't miss out. You can grab your copy of the book on Amazon right now. To kick off this week's episode, we're going to look at yet another classic that I haven't yet featured on the show. You can find this story in Kowabana Origins, but it makes its podcast debut today, and for good reason. I'll be posting an internet mystery video to the Kowabana YouTube channel tomorrow on this very topic. So, if you haven't read the story yet, here's your chance to catch up. Along with Kotori Bako, this was one of the biggest stories to come out on Ni Channel in 2005, and is still considered a classic today. This one's called Ryomen Sukuna. I work in construction, and the other day I was called out to an old temple in Iwate Prefecture to pull it down. Nobody visits the temple anymore. So anyway, after we were done demolishing it, my colleague called me over. "Hey, come over here for a sec, would ya?" I went over and there was a long black wooden box sitting by his feet. "What's that?" "I dunno. I was wondering that myself." It was in an airtight room in the back of the main temple building. I think I'll give the contractor a quick call. The box was about 2 meters long. It looked rather old and was maybe even starting to rot. A white piece of paper with something written on it was stuck to the surface. I knew they were old kanji, but they looked kinda like Sanskrit to me, and the paper was so old that I couldn't make out what it was saying. All I could make out was Taisho, year, July, by means of cursing, Ryomen Sukuna, 2 seals. Something like that. The box was nailed shut, so it wasn't like I could just open it. The contractor told us he'd asked the former chief priest the next day, so we put the box in the temp building that we'd set up for the job. So, the next day, just before we arrived at the demolition site, we got a call from the contractor. "So about that box," he said. I asked the former chief priest and he told me in no uncertain terms, do not open it. He said he'll come and pick it up himself, so please hand it over to him when he gets there. I thought I should call the site foreman and tell him about the box beforehand, just in case. I'd like to speak to you about that box from yesterday," I said. "Oh yeah, that," the foreman replied. "There are 2 Chinese guys working here, right? They went ahead and opened the thing. We'd better hurry, come on." I had a bad feeling about it, but I hurried towards the site. There were 5 or 6 people standing around the temp building. So this guy opened it with his buddy last night for fun. Now the problem is what was inside it. "Go on, take a look," the foreman said. To get straight to the point, there was a mummy inside, holding both its fists up like a boxer. But what was really strange was that it had 2 heads. It wasn't deformed like conjoined twins. I think it was probably a hoax. After seeing that in there, the 2 of them haven't spoken since. I don't know if it's because of the shock or not. No matter how many questions we asked the 2 Chinese guys, they just sat there staring into space. And they both spoke Japanese quite well usually. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention it, but the mummy was bizarrely shaped. Like, with each head it had 2 arms on each side, 2 left and 2 right. I've seen a lot of strange photos on the internet, and while I was surprised, I thought it was just a fake. So anyway, the 2 Chinese guys were sent to the hospital, and we debated calling the police, but then the former chief priest's son, the priest was over 80 years old, drove towards us. The first thing out of his mouth was, "You opened it? Who was the idiot who opened it? It's all over. If you open it, it's all over." We were shocked at how threatening he was, but then he started yelling at his son. The Iwate accent is a little difficult to follow, so I'll write it down in regular Japanese. "I told you to make sure you sent Ryomen Sukuna-sama to the temple in Kyoto," the priest said. I couldn't catch the name of the temple. "Now look at what happened because you didn't. You idiot!" He was so pissed off that he didn't look like an old guy who was actually over 80. "Who opened it?" he continued. "They're in the hospital?" They can't be helped now anyway, but I'll do what I can to cleanse the rest of you." To be honest, we were all scared. We sat still as he recited sutras and smacked us on the back and shoulders. This went on for about 30 minutes. He then put the wooden box into the back of his car and, as he was about to leave, said to us, "I'm sorry, but you'll be unable to live long lives now." After that, one of the Chinese guys suffered a heart attack that confused even the doctors, and then died. The other was sent to a mental hospital, and 3 of the labourers fell sick with high fevers. I stood on a nail myself and needed to get 5 stitches in my foot. I don't know the finer details, but I reckon that mummy faced discrimination while alive due to its deformity, and so died, leaving behind a terrible grudge. I mean, it had a terrifying expression on its face. I wonder if there was a Buraku village near that temple in the past. Maybe not. But I want to live a long life. So, we just had a blackout and lost power. It freaked me out. I love looking at the occult forums. I'm a big fan of this sort of stuff, and so I wanted to know the truth about what happened. I contacted the priest several times, but he's been ignoring me completely. But I found his son's contact information. He's over 50 and works in real estate, and he was considerably bright and cheerful, all things considered. So, thinking I might get something from him, I made an appointment to go out drinking with him tonight. Although, it could get late. If I find out anything, I'll let you guys know tomorrow. I remember something about Ryomen Sukuna appearing in the Professor Munakata manga series. The Sukuna tribe were foreigners that came to Japan a long time ago and taught the people of ancient Japan about culture. This formed the cultural basis of Izumo province and was the motive for the story of the white hair from Inaba and Okuninushi's building of the nation of Izumo. Then the Yamato imperial court invaded Izumo and the Sukuna tribe were chased out to Hida province. According to the Nihon Shoki, there was a monster in Hida province called Sukuna. It was killing people, so soldiers were sent to exterminate it. So what this means is that the Sukuna were foreigners who imparted culture to Japan in the time before the Yamato imperial court. It's written that perhaps they were iron manufacturers from ancient India, and so they brought iron manufacturing to Japan. Then, the following was found written on a statue found deep in a cave in Izumo. Ryomen Sukuna. It's written that the Sukuna tribe came to Japan via the Rama boat, a mirror boat, a boat that was said to be so dark that it glistened like a mirror. Rama was a type of ebony tree. The box was also blackened, so perhaps it was also made of Rama. If so, then Ryomen Sukuna-sama was probably a descendant of the Sukuna tribe that escaped to the Iwate area. But I was thinking as I typed all this up that it probably doesn't fit on the occult boards. I'm sorry. I said before that I wanted to meet the guy in person, but the priest's son called and asked if we could speak over the phone, so I asked him to tell me what he could. We spoke for about half an hour. He really likes to talk. I'll write down the main points of what we spoke about. Sorry, I was reminded of my father. We really shouldn't speak over the phone either. No, I'm the one who should be sorry, forcing you to talk. So, just what was that thing? It was a deformed person displayed in exhibitions during the Taisho era. So, it was alive during that time? Like conjoined twins? That's right. It seemed that he lived in a particular village in Iwate for a few years after being born, but then his parents fell into poverty and he was sold. Eventually, he was passed on to the exhibitions. Is that so? But why is he a mummy now? To be honest, he was turned into a Buddhist mummy. A Buddhist mummy? By himself? You're gonna tell the others about this, aren't you? Honestly? I'd like to. Okay, well, at least you're honest. Well, it's not like I'm gonna tell you everything anyways. He was forced to become like that. There was a terrible cult around at the time. You'll have to forgive me for not telling you their name. They're still secretly working, even now. Is it a name that, if you hear it, anyone would know who they are? I don't know. They're the most secretive of all secret cults. They really are evil. Is that so? The leader is a real piece of work. He only uses things outside of Buddhist teachings. Outside of? To put it simply, he does things he shouldn't. Not too long ago, the Tachikawa school of Buddhism was denounced as paganism and outside of the Buddhist teachings, right? Well, they've got nothing on this guy. What do you mean exactly? Well, there are no documents left from that time, and they used an alias. Plus, they're not the type of guys to work in the background. And supposing that their religious organization is still around even now, their current leader would have absolutely no connection to them. But I'll give you a name. Mononobe Tengoku. That's the name of the founder. Mononobe Tengoku. That's an alias, right? Yes, of course. So, when this Tengoku went to the exhibition, he bought several of the deformed people for a large sum of money. And this conjoined twin, did you call him? He bought him too. And then? Have you ever heard of kodoku? It's written with the kanji for insect and poison. But the kanji for insect is a special one that repeats the same pattern 3 times. That type of magic where they put a bunch of poisonous insects in a jar and then use the one that survives. Yeah, that's it. How did you know about that? That's amazing. Oh, it's nothing. And then what? Oh yeah, so Tengoku used kodoku magic, but with people. He put people in a secret room? You're lying. It's just what I heard from my dad. I don't believe it 100% either. Do you want me to stop? I'm sorry. Please continue. Okay, so he performed it with these deformed people. I don't know where the headquarters for the religion was located, but he put them in a secret room in the basement. The one that was left at the end was the conjoined twins. How long were they locked up in there for? I don't know the finer details, but long enough to eat the flesh of the others in the room, and then their own excrement. I'm sure you can imagine from that. I don't really want to. It seemed like it was designed by Tengoku for the conjoined twins to win right from the start. The other people were attacked with fatal knife wounds before being thrown into the room. And when we say he was deformed, he looked like Ashura, the Buddhist demigod with several heads and arms. So it's likely Tengoku was enthralled with that. I see. And so, while he lived, he was nothing more than a tool to Tengoku. He was immediately placed in another room and starved to death. Then he was embalmed and they performed Sokushin Butsu on him, the process of making a Buddhist mummy. This turned him into what my father mentioned earlier, Ryomen Sukuna. And what does Ryomen Sukuna mean? He went on to explain that the conjoined twins were called Ryomen Sukuna because in the past, close to the time of Japanese mythology, there was a monster with the same name that had 2 heads and 4 arms. Is that so? So then, Tengoku used this Ryomen Sukuna as an object of worship for his religion, as a kind of cursed Buddha. He could curse and kill other people, at worst, a lot of people, using this terrifying cursed Buddha. That's what Tengoku believed, anyway. Who was the target of his curse? The nation. That's what my father said. Japan itself? This Tengoku was screwed up in the head. Yeah, he probably was. But that wasn't the only effect of the curse. He put something inside Ryomen Sukuna's belly. What? The bones of the ancients. The Matsuro Wano people who were overthrown by the Yamato imperial court. In other words, those who were considered rebels by the court. Traitors. He ground their bones into a fine powder and put them inside his stomach. How on earth did he manage to get those? You've seen it on TV or in the newspapers, right? When they excavate an ancient grave or ruin, there are excavators there. At the time, security wasn't that great. In general, he stole them from those sorts of sites. All of a sudden, it's a little hard to believe all this. Right? I thought the same thing. But in the Taisho period alone, there were these great disasters. 1914, Sakurajima eruption. 1914, Akita earthquake. 1914, Hojo coal mine explosion. 1916, Hakodate Great Fire. 1917, Great Eastern Japan flood. 1917, Kirino coal mine explosion. 1922, Hokurikusen avalanche. 1923, Great Kanto earthquake. So? These were all areas that Ryomen Sukuna was moved to. No way. Did this religion really have branches in all those places? I mean, it's gotta be a coincidence. I also thought it was a foolish story, but the biggest disaster during the Taisho period was the Great Kanto earthquake, right? Tengoku died just before the earthquake took place, that very day. He died? I heard it was a suicide. There were rumors that he wasn't a full-blooded Japanese person as well. How did he die? He cut his throat with a Japanese sword in front of Ryomen Sukuna. Then, he wrote his final testament in his own blood. What did he write? Japan must be destroyed. This was right before the Great Kanto earthquake? That's right. It was just a coincidence, right? Perhaps. Where were Tengoku and Ryomen Sukuna at the time? In the epicenter, close to Sagami Bay. So how did Ryomen Sukuna end up in a temple in Iwate Prefecture after that? That was the only thing my father wouldn't tell me. Your father said to us that time, "Why didn't you send him to the temple in Kyoto?" What did that mean? I heard about that. It was about 30 years ago though. I was supposed to become the chief priest after my father, but I was a little, you might say, careless at the time, and I made mistakes. After that, I abandoned the temple. That's all I can say. Is that so? So, where is Ryomen Sukuna now? That I don't know. I mean, I haven't heard from my father in a few days now. After he took him, he was apparently being tailed by a strange car. Really? You said you couldn't tell me everything, but why did you tell me this much already? My father said it himself, didn't he? It was unfortunate, but you won't live a very long life. Well, that's about everything. Don't call me again. Thank you. That's the summary of our phone call. To be quite blunt, I don't believe everything he said. But I'm not feeling too well anymore, so I'm gonna go crash. Sorry for such a long story. Don't forget to check out the internet mystery video for Ryomen Sukuna on our YouTube channel tomorrow. Now, our next story is about a young man who moves into his grandparents' house after his parents get divorced. The town has a collection of statues known as the Headhunting Jizo statues, and he soon finds out the terrifying reason behind their name, and why nobody should ever go near them. This one's called Headhunting Jizo Statues. My parents got divorced when I was in elementary school, and my mother took me back to her parents' house to live. They lived in a small, lonely town up in the Tohoku region. There were few houses and only a single tiny supermarket. There wasn't even a convenience store. I transferred to the elementary school there, but there were only 20 kids in total, and only 3 other kids the same age as me. One day, about a year and a half after I moved there, one of the kids in the grade above me started bullying me. I can't remember why, but it probably wasn't over anything major. At any rate, I grew to hate this kid and wished that he would disappear. At that point, I remembered the Headhunting Jizo statues. My grandfather had told me about them when we moved there. They were 3 headless statues in the forest by the small park. People said that you weren't supposed to give them any offerings, no matter what. They wouldn't tell me why, but not long after transferring, one of the kids in my class told me. If you made an offering to those statues, and then asked them, "Please kill someone for me," then that person would die. Well then, time to make an offering to them, I thought. I did my best to save food from lunch, and then I offered 2 rice balls to the statues. Then I prayed to them. That night, footsteps woke me from my sleep. It sounded like someone walking around wearing armor. "Not enough," a voice said. Oh yeah, there were 3 Jizo statues. I needed to leave another rice ball. The next morning, I took another rice ball with me to school. I dropped by the statues on my way there, and the 2 rice balls were still there. I offered the 3rd one, and then I heard a voice scream at me from behind. "You stupid little brat! What do you think you're doing?" An old man came running over, and then he slapped me hard across the face. He dragged me all the way back to my house, and then he started screaming something at my grandparents as well, before leaving. That evening, numerous people came from the village to our house. My grandparents apologized to all of them. Their Tohoku accents were so thick that I couldn't really make out what they were saying, but I apologized alongside them. It seemed I had done something truly terrible. Discussions carried on for several days, and in the end, it was decided that our family would be ostracized. Families who made offerings to the Headhunting Jizo statues were to be ostracized. It had apparently always been that way. I didn't know what that meant exactly, but it was forbidden for anyone in the village to talk to us. The supermarket wasn't allowed to sell anything to us, and my mother was fired from her nursing job at the hospital, and I wasn't allowed to go to school anymore either. I went to the town hall with my mother where she protested what was going on, but they wouldn't listen to her either. It was no use. We couldn't continue living there. We discussed moving to Tokyo or something, but my grandparents didn't want to leave. They were born in that village, and they'd spent their entire lives there. And when the time came, they wanted to die there as well. They told the two of us to leave and go to Tokyo instead. My mother was worried about them, but if we stayed, she wouldn't be able to work, and I wouldn't be able to go to school. We just couldn't keep living there. So in the end, we moved to Tokyo. We frequently called my grandparents and sent them food, but before long, their phone line was disconnected and we were unable to get through. They sometimes called us from a public phone when they went out shopping, but other than that, we only heard from them in the occasional letter. I think something else must have happened to them as well, but it was like they'd given up and accepted everything coming their way. Several years passed, and I started high school. Even then, I still couldn't get that town out of my head. Not because I'd done something wrong, or because I'd made life worse for my grandparents, but because I could still hear those footsteps. Nothing special happened. I could just hear them. But still, that alone was creepy enough. One day, we got a phone call from the delivery company. They'd been to my grandparents' house several times, but nobody was answering the door. A bad feeling washed over me, yet part of me had already suspected something was wrong. They would have called us if something was wrong, and yet nobody had answered after several attempts by the delivery company. We went back right away. It was late that night when we arrived, and there were no lights on in the house. We banged on the door, but there was no response. It was a sliding door that easily came off. I removed it, and the instant I stepped foot inside, I knew what was going on. The house stank of something rotten. I turned to look at my mother, and she was shaking, tears running down her cheeks. We turned the lights on and went further inside. Where were they? The bedroom? The bedroom was at the end of the hall. The door to the left was open as we passed it. The family altar room. I glanced inside and saw my grandmother, floating. She was hanging from a rope. My grandfather was lying dead in the same room, in his futon. My mother bawled like a kid. I tried to move her outside, but she wouldn't budge. I tried to call the police, but cell phones weren't so common at the time, so we were out of range. I had to walk all the way to the closest police box. The police explained that my grandfather had died of illness, and my grandmother then killed herself. She had decided to follow him to the grave. We didn't hold a funeral for them, but rather invited a monk over who read for them and then burned the bodies. We stopped back at the house on the day of our return so we could pick up some photos and things. Yet, they had nothing to their name other than the house itself. That would be the last time we ever visited that town. While my mother was finishing things up, I went for a walk. I followed the same road I used to take to school. I stopped by the swings at the park to think for a while. What should I do? I didn't want to have anything to do with that town any longer. Should we just go straight home? But what about those footsteps and that voice? If I wanted to get rid of them, there was only one thing I could do. I entered the forest and gave the Jizo statues the rice ball I'd brought with me. I had to wish for something. But who? No name came to mind. Who did I want to kill? Please kill everyone in this town, I prayed. 5 or 6 people in the park turned to look at me. I had no idea who they were, but they probably knew who I was. I approached them, and they averted their gazes. Nobody said a thing. I stopped hearing the voice and footsteps after that. I have no idea what happened to the people in that town. I later asked my mother about the origin of those statues. This was something I heard 10 years ago, and something she heard as a child, so the details are a little vague now. But those statues had long been there, since well before my grandparents were born. Before they became known as the Headhunting Jizo statues, they were known as the Headless Jizo statues. We don't know why they didn't have heads. At any rate, nobody made offerings to them because they were so creepy. There was only one man who would put his hands together in prayer before them and give them offerings. And then one day, that man was killed. They never found who did it, but his mother never gave up looking. She visited the statues in her son's stead, and she prayed to them to find her son's killer. Several days passed, and 2 people died. One of them was strangled, and the other had their head cut off. Normally, people would chalk this up to a serial killer, but the other townsfolk believed these 2 to be the killers, and the Headless Jizo statues had granted the mother's wish. After that, the number of people giving the statues offerings increased, and several people died. And so, at some point, people started calling the Headless Jizo statues the Headhunting Jizo statues instead. People couldn't just let things continue as they were, so it became forbidden to give them any offerings, and anyone who did was immediately ostracized. That's the extent of what I know. Numerous stories we've featured on Kowabana have been about the strange and often terrifying rituals that small, out-of-the-way villages have. In this one, another young boy visits his grandmother and discovers that her village also has a peculiar and honestly baffling ritual. But it's not all oddities, and getting too close might get him killed. Find out why in Villages Without Pinkies. This happened when I went to visit my grandmother on my mother's side. I had never met her before, but we heard she didn't have much longer to live, so we decided to go see her that next weekend. I'd never seen her before because she lived so far away. We lived in the Chugoku region, while she lived in the Tohoku region. The trip there was uneventful, but when we arrived at the train station, my parents went and rented a car, which struck me as rather odd. I soon realized why. My grandmother lived in a small village deep in the mountains. I'd never been there before, so I didn't know the full details, but apparently it was one of those tiny, out-of-the-way villages. Something like that. There were a few dozen old houses, and we saw people here and there, so it wasn't that tiny, but still pretty small. We left early that morning, so by the time we arrived at my grandmother's house, the sun had already set, and we were exhausted. Still, first thing we did was go and greet my grandmother. She was pretty old, close to 100, I'd say, but I remembered her tone of voice being very clear and stable. That evening, we ate dinner at my grandmother's house and then went to sleep. I don't know where exactly her house was, but it was somewhere in Miyagi Prefecture. I lived in Okayama. After breakfast the following morning, some villagers came over to my grandmother's house with vegetables and other food, and we had a bit of a party. There was also booze, so while my dad drank and chatted with the other men from the village, I ate all the food. Before long, some other villagers with children arrived. For some reason, small kids really liked me, and I often played with my younger cousins, so it wasn't long until I had a group of elementary school children following me around, begging me to play with them. After getting permission from our parents, we all went outside to play. My grandfather had already passed away at that point in time. This was before I was even born, so I never met him. But anyway, while I was playing with these village kids, I noticed something strange. Every single one of them was missing their pinky finger. I really wanted to ask why, but it felt kind of awkward. So I tried not to think about it, but I couldn't get it out of my head. I think it was around 3 p.m. when we stopped playing and went back inside the house for a break. But I couldn't stop thinking about all their missing pinkies, and as I watched the other people in the room, I realized every single villager there was also missing their pinky finger. I'd never once seen a severed finger before, so it was hard to say with confidence, but it looked like it had been done deliberately. It wasn't like I could stare at their missing fingers for too long, but the cut was too clean to be anything but deliberate. I was more creeped out than surprised. I knew it wasn't something I should ask about, but I tried asking my mother anyway. As expected, she wouldn't answer me. And on that note, my mother did have her pinky. She wasn't born in the village, so maybe that was why. But anyway, I am a human being. I was curious, and so I went and asked my grandmother about it. She'd been a part of the party until us kids went out to play, but it seemed at that point she'd returned to her room, which was all the better for me. I went to see her and asked about it. I told her about everything and asked if she'd tell me. At the same time, I confirmed that my grandmother was missing her pinky as well. But in the end, my grandmother refused to tell me anything about it as well. That just made me even more curious, and thinking that I might ask the other kids instead, I joined those playing outside again. I set my sights on the mischievous boy and casually asked him about his pinky, like it was no big deal. Yet he threw the question back at me. Why do you have a pinky? Seemed it was normal in this village not to have one. Things got even weirder. He explained to me that their pinkies were protecting the village. I didn't quite understand what that meant, and the boy said he would show me. He took me to the place with all their pinkies. There was a mountain on the outskirts of the village, and at the top of a long flight of stairs, there was something like a shrine gate with, I guess, a shrine behind it. But there was a sign in front of the gate that said, "No entry," and there was barbed wire to keep people out as well. "You can't go in there!" the boy screamed as I tried to go inside. His scream frightened me, and so we decided to quickly head back. That night, I told my grandmother about what happened earlier in the day. She got super pissed at me, ranting and raving. "You didn't go inside, did you?" she asked over and over, and I guess in the end she figured that she had to tell me all about it to satisfy my curiosity. Let me sum it up. This thing with the pinkies had been around since before my grandmother was born. It was cut off by an adult exactly 1 year after someone was born. That finger was then placed in something they called a box and offered at the shrine on top of the mountain. And if anyone other than the adults went near that shrine, they would be cursed. We returned home soon after that, and nothing bad happened to me. If you've ever heard any stories similar to this one, then please let me know as well. Our final story for this week sees a group of friends exploring the mountains one day when they come across what looks like an abandoned temple. But it's the old house next to it that proves to be truly terrifying when they discover what's inside. Find out why in Fanatics in the Abandoned Temple. When I was in junior high, I went exploring Mount S behind my house with some friends. There were about 5 of us. Taking the regular paths wouldn't be any fun, so we climbed the mountain through the trees and such. Before long, we came across a small open area, and in it was a temple and a small house. We barged in and noticed something odd right away. The white clothes that priests and shrine maidens wear were scattered all over the ground here and there. They were covered in mud and looked rather old. We went over to the temple, but there was nobody there. The door was unlocked, so we went inside to see if we could maybe find any monetary offerings, but there was nothing there at all. All we found was some more clothes lying near the offering box. A large black caterpillar crawled over the top of the clothes. It was gross, so we stepped away from it. "Hey guys, over here, quickly!" One of my friends suddenly screamed, his face turning pale. He was over by the small house next to the temple. Seemed he'd gone inside without permission because the front door was open. This is bad, guys. Seriously bad. Intrigued by what was bothering him so much, we rushed over, and almost threw up the moment we went inside. The place was disgusting. We recoiled in horror, but the first guy forcibly dragged us back in. It was like a bomb site. There were newspapers, empty sake bottles, and leftover bento boxes, underwear, tableware, some sort of rubbish I couldn't even make out. There was gross stuff everywhere. The dining table had also been turned over, and it was hard to tell where the furniture ended and the rubbish began. An old calendar hung beside the door, and looking closer, it seemed to say 1977. There was one more room in the back, and the other guy stood in front of it with a face that said, "Come on, hurry it up." The room in the back stank. There were several bad smells mixed together that I couldn't really place. Nervously, we went inside, but it was too dark to see much. All we could tell was that the room was a mess, just like the rest of the house. Something that looked like a large pot had been overturned in the middle of the room, and its contents had spilt all over the floor. Some miso soup, maybe? The closet was empty, but the roof had rotted away, and the boards hung down inside it. There was also a TV and a dresser, but both had been overturned and broken. And yet, none of that compared to the one thing that truly assaulted our eyes. The walls were packed to the brim with diapers. There were so many that light couldn't even get in through the windows. The place stank to the high heavens. I screamed and tried to run, but the other guys found it hilarious and started searching through the room. Before long, one of them found a dictionary lying in the middle of the floor. There was a pen attached to it, and it stood out as the only thing that appeared to be well looked after in the whole house. It was a plain old kanji dictionary, but here and there in the white spaces, there were a few things scribbled in pen. Yet the writing was nothing more than scribble, and so impossible to read. We flicked through it, and right on the last page there was a message in pen. "May I hear the voice of Nani Nani-sama?" We couldn't make out what the name was, and as we were trying to figure it out, another friend found a sleeping bag in the bottom of the closet. He tried pulling it out, but it was too heavy to move. I screamed. "Shit! There's a dead body in there! This is their suicide note! Quick, let's get out of here!" My friend let go of the bag in shock at my loud voice. "Nah, let's open it," said another friend. But that strange smell in the room had really gotten to me. I was terrified. Then my eyes stopped on that hole in the closet roof. "Someone's coming," I said, pointing to it. I had no idea where those words came from, but I said it. I screamed and ran from the room at full speed. The other guys also screamed and then followed me. Once we'd descended the mountain somewhat, we stopped to catch our breath. Panic had overtaken me the whole time. "Let's go back and check if it really was a dead body," one of my friends said. But the other guys were just as scared as me, and not a single person agreed. We all dragged ourselves home. After that, someone would occasionally bring that temple back up, and we even set out to find it again several times. But no matter how hard we looked, we never did. Before long, everyone stopped talking about it. Last year, I got together with a few of my buddies from junior high for the first time in a while. It had been a while, but one of them mentioned that temple again. And so we got a bit carried away and decided to go back up the mountain to find it once more. "We found a strange path, right?" We laughed and chatted on the way, and then by chance we happened upon that same opening with the temple. We were shocked. We'd just been walking around aimlessly. That fear I felt the first time around flared back to life, and we slowly approached it in anticipation. But unlike the first time, there was a black iron fence surrounding the building, and so we couldn't get in. The fence was even covered in barbed wire. Surprised, we walked around the perimeter, and then found a sign written in red. "No entry, except for devotees." Satisfied with our discovery, we went back down the mountain. What on earth did we see when we were in junior high? Maybe some type of dangerous cult was living there. Just thinking about it frightened me. A huge thank you and shout out to this week's Kami tier member, Jojo. It's thanks to your support, along with everyone else, that I'm able to keep doing this show, so thank you very much. Don't forget to check out Toshiden Volume 3, available on Amazon right now. And if you'd like to chat about this week's stories, come and join us in the Kowabana Discord. You can find that link in the description or on kowabana.net. You can also check out our Patreon at patreon.com/TaraADevlin for exclusive bonus stories and extras, or our YouTube channel at youtube.com/KowabanaJapan for all sorts of Japanese horror you won't find anywhere else. Thanks guys, stay safe, and I'll see you again next time for even more Kowabana, true Japanese scary stories from around the internet. Want even more scary stories? Head over to kowabana.net for new translations every week. You can also join our Patreon for exclusive stories you won't find anywhere else. Head over to kowabana.net now.